The application number field has been added to the Pro-Forma Invoice screen for better tracking of the number of progress claims that have been made for the project. Acumatica introduced this feature to better adhere to the structure of an AIA contract, which is the standard in the US. And although we do not see the same standard being used for the most part in Australia and New Zealand, having that internal numbering sequence for the progress claims that's unique to a project still has some benefits in terms of reporting. So I've gone into MYOB Advanced to see that the application number in action. So on here, as you can see, I already have one progress claim that I've actually already invoiced. And if you notice, for that pro-forma invoice or progress claim, we already have an application number, just one. On the project itself, you can actually keep track of the last application number that was used, right? And now if I run billing for this project, we can see that the application number has been set to 2. So now that you have that specific numbering sequence for your progress claims within that project, it just makes referencing specific progress claims a lot easier to your customer. In construction, it's fairly common for you to receive a bill from one of your subcontractors that you'll then need to pay to them and to another subcontractor that they've hired to help them. Now, ideally, you're made aware of this at the time that you enter the bill into the system, so you can enter them as joint payees for that bill. In practice, however, it's quite different. There are instances where you've already entered the bill into the system and then learn of that fact later on. So we've introduced changes to the joint payee function in the system to address that. So prior to 2021.1, you couldn't enter additional joint payees once you've released the bill, but starting 2020.1, you'll be able to. I've gone back to our site to see this scenario in action. So what we have here is just a bill from one of our subcontractors. And if you notice, it's already in open status because we've already released it. Now on top of that, I've actually created a payment document for the bill. Right? As we learned, you can still add the payee to a bill even after you've released it. So I've selected joint payees on here. Now let me add an additional vendor. In this sort of scenario, we're not going to be able to change the amounts that we have on here to assign to our joint payee. And that's because we already have that payment document. But if we go into that payment document, we can actually see that we can reload the joint payees on here. And now we can set the amount to pay. So if I set this to 1,000, the payment will now be split between the two subcontractors. The substantiated billing report has also been changed as part of 2021.1. As with the rest of the components of the construction edition, it's no longer a customization and it has become part of the core product. The formatting of the report itself has been changed too, just to improve the readability of the report. The consolidated version of the report has also been updated. Initially, it only allows for PDF files to be attached. Now it allows a JPEG and other graphic formats to be attached as well. With 2021.1, we've also introduced enhancements on how retentions are computed and allocated for projects with a set contract cap. In the past, when a cap is set for a project, often this cap is reached after the first few progress claims, leaving the retention disproportionately allocated to the first few revenue budget lines. The new calculation we've introduced uses a weighting method to proportionally distribute the allocation of retention. Now let's jump back into Advanced and see how that works in practice. The best way for us to understand how this new calculation works is to compare how the system used to calculate it in our older versions against how it's done in 2021.1. So what I've done here is I've created a project that uses contract cap retainage in one of our older versions. So the contract total we're going to be using is $2 million, and we've set the cap to 50%. So meaning we can only charge retention up to $1 million. And since we've set the retention to 10%, our cap for the total retention is at $100,000. Now the total contract amount of $2 million is broken down into two different tasks, each with $1 million expected revenue. So I've already invoiced the project ahead of time. Now let's look at how the retention behaved between the two progress claims that I made. So for the first pro forma invoice, what I did was claim the whole 100% for the first task, meaning I charged my customer a progress claim of 1 million. And as you can see, since we have our retention set to 10%, it charged it retained $100,000 for us. Now at this point we've reached the cap for our overall cap for the project. So now when I raise my second progress claim, which is just for the second task, I can see that I have none of the retention allocated to my second line. Now let's look at how 2020.1 behaves given the same exact scenario. So if I open up our first progress claim, again we charged 100% completion for the first revenue budget line, and again we see that the retention amount allocated to it is the whole 100,000. But this time when we open our progress claim for the second revenue budget line, we can see that the 100,000 retention was distributed equally across the two revenue budget lines, since their amounts are equal. So now the retention allocation is more reflective of the actual value of each of the revenue budget lines, which is important, especially when you encounter issues with releasing your retentions later on with your customer. 2021.1 also introduces a way to correct pro forma invoices. This action is done through the pro forma invoice screen itself and can be done even after the corresponding AR invoice is released. This is an improvement over creating credit memos directly, as it allows you to keep track of all of the revisions done, including all the corresponding AR invoices and credit memos created. Here's an example of a pro forma invoice that I have corrected. So if we look to the lower right here, we can see the original AR invoice that was created when we first released the pro forma invoice and the corresponding credit memo that reversed it. Now, an important thing to note here too is that we get to keep the same reference number and application number for the pro forma invoice. This means that it prevents any sort of confusion with your customer where you send a different reference number each time you create a correction to your progress claim. Now let's try to correct this pro forma invoice one last time. So for that, we need to go to Actions and correct pro forma invoice. What it does for us is it opens up the pro forma invoice again by putting it on hold, right? But in the background, this has created a credit memo as well. So I can go about treating the Pro-Forma invoice as if it was still in the hold status. So if, let's say, for example, if the actual amount that the customer agreed to was only 800,000, I can change that and then release this as I would any other Pro-Forma invoice. Again, it should generate for me another AR invoice. It's also important to note that there are some limitations to this correction workflow. Firstly, it's only available for progress billed invoices and not for time and material. The billing currency must also be the same as the project currency for it to work. And if there are any existing payment applications already done to the AR invoice, those need to be removed before you can do the correction. The retainage or retention invoices related to the Pro-Forma invoice also do not get corrected automatically, so they must be manually reversed or deleted. And finally, as we've discussed, the correction of workflow actually does a full GL reversal of the original AR invoice and then posts a new invoice after you've corrected the Pro-Forma invoice. So it does not post any delta transactions in the GL. That concludes our run through of the different enhancements and changes that we are introducing in the construction.